Can you imagine Warren Buffett driving around in a stretch limousine and just throwing out millions of dollars out his window and hoping that it would land in a bank vault, or an investment banker will take his money and give him a rate of return? Well, that's really what happens in this week's gospel with the protagonist. So in the gospel this week, Jesus tells the parable, which is a story that is meant to shock us a little bit into looking at something a different way. He tells the parable of the sower who goes out to sow seed, right? Seed to produce a harvest of wheat or some kind of grain. Now, you and I, if we were going to plant a harvest, we would have nice rows and we would drop the seed. And not this sower. This sower is like the prodigal sower. He's just throwing it everywhere. He doesn't care where it lands. He's just reaching in his bag and throwing it everywhere. In fact, 75% of the seed that he throws out fails. Some falls on hard ground, some falls on rocky ground, some falls on ground that is choked with thorns and weeds, and only 25% falls onto fertile ground, fertile soil that produces 100-fold, 60-fold, 30-fold. So 75% of this sower is wasted, but that represents God's grace, that God is throwing his grace upon us all the time. And it's not God's fault if we don't receive the grace. It's our fault, because the point of the gospel is that we need to look at our souls, our hearts, and see what kind of ground are we prepared to receive God's word, God's grace. Are our hearts hardened, like that hard ground? Are our hearts, filled with lots of rocks, so that God's word can't really take root? Or is our lives so busy that we can't spend enough time with God's word, so God's word can't really produce a lot in us? Or have we done the work that's necessary for God's work to take root in our souls and in our hearts? Because when you think about it, think for a second about Ireland. Right? We've all seen beautiful pictures of Ireland and the 40 shades of green. We all know about that. And we've seen pictures of Ireland and these beautiful fields, but surrounding those fields are walls of rocks, all real pretty though, real pretty walls. But those rocks were taken from the field and put around the field as walls. But the work that had to be done to remove those rocks was incredible in order for those beautiful shades of green to grow. But the rocks had to be removed. So when we think about our own souls, are our hearts so hardened? But if they're that hardened, you're not even watching this video. So I'm not really worried about the people that their hearts are so hardened. But maybe perchance you are looking at that and you're so cynical and you're such a doubter. You're so sarcastic that you keep thinking like, yeah, God, let God prove it to me. Well, then you're that person where the seed just bounces off you like Teflon, all right? But then you might be a person who's filled with anger, resentment, hurt, and you've got these rocks in your soul, and God's word can't take root because it's so filled with these rocks. And maybe for a little while it's like, oh yeah, but then you think about those resentments and those angers, those hurts, and and God's word withers in the sun of those conditions. Maybe we want to be so good at our Christianity, but we're so busy with our lives that, we want to make a little bit of time for God. And so the worldly allure of security, or work, or money, status, possessions, those things choke out the word because we are more worried about stuff than we are about God's grace and our relationship with God in our lives. And so that chokes out God's word. And that's what the thorns represent in the gospel. But if we've done the hard work, and the truth is, to really let this gospel sink in, we have to get into a construction zone We have to get a backhoe. We have to pull out rocks and all sorts of things that are in the way of God's word. But we have to do the work. We have to be willing to do the work. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, nah, I can't be bothered. What's the point? I don't have the time. But that's our mistake. And we'll rue that at the end of our lives if that's our attitude. But Jesus wanted his audience, and he wanted us to understand that God is just this generous person throwing grace at us and wants us to have 160, 30-fold results in our lives. But God knows, Jesus knows that when, are we willing to do the work? Or are we just cynical? Are we just too busy? Or are we just too filled with hurt and anger, and we don't want to do the work that's necessary for God's word to take root in our lives, in our hearts, in our souls? So maybe this week we'll think about it. We'll think, what condition is my soul in? What is the soil of my soul looking like? Hard, rocky, filled with thorns and weeds? Or is it nice and fertile? Probably not fertile completely, unless you're constantly working on this. I know mine's not. So I need some work I got a lot of work to do, actually. Maybe you do too. And then we can reap the results of the work in the harvest that's produced, hopefully, 100-fold. Have a great week.